Ladies and gentlemen, I'm of the firm belief that you right now can play Planetside at a good FPS with your current equipment with a few small tweaks. And in this video, I want to go through and explain everything with full clarity. First off, I do want to explain why do you want to increase your FPS. It's because it means that the rate of fire of your gun won't be lower. That's the first reason. There's a bug in the game which means that the rate of your fire of your gun will be lower unless you have smoothing turned on, or if you have above 150 FPS in those large fights. Even if the refresh rate of your monitor is only 60 Hz, you'll generally want to go to 100 FPS in order to make sure that each time your monitor refreshes, there's a new frame there ready for it. Likewise, if you have a 144 Hz monitor or something similar, you'll generally want around 200 FPS if you can get there. And that will make everything look a lot more smooth, and it will make people, when they're peeking you or you're peeking them, make sure they appear on the correct frame, not a few frames after. And likewise, if you're having to turn on VSync and stuff, there might be a small amount of delay, and so having a high FPS generally will make that delay not as big of a deal. Now, before we go into the graphics settings, I want you guys to install a crosshair on your computer because it'll help your aim a bunch. So go to GitHub and install Crossover. On screen now, you can see a basic guide of what to do, and it will definitely feel better with a crosshair than without. After you've done that, you're going to want to turn off Windows mouse acceleration in the Windows settings, because Windows mouse acceleration increases non-linearly, and so as you move faster with your mouse, it will actually unpredictably speed up. And so you want to, instead of that, replace that with what's called raw accel, which you can also find in GitHub. And I'm going to here just give you a small preset that you can use if you want to, as a general good idea of something that you could use instead of Windows mouse acceleration. When you've done this as well, you're going to want to make sure that you have raw accel on startup for your computer, otherwise you're going to have to go enable it every time, and I know that you motherfuckers ain't going to remember, let's just be honest. So now that you got your crosshair, you got your raw accel on your computer, you've turned off Windows mouse acceleration, and you generally have a good idea of what FPS you're trying to reach. I do also want to say, by the way, make sure in the Steam overlay settings that you have the FPS counter on, because it's a nice easy way to see your FPS. After that, go into your task manager and go to the startup button and see if you got anything there that you can turn off, because that means when you're in game, you're going to have less stuff running in the background. Likewise, if you enjoy, for whatever reason, watching YouTube or something else on the internet whilst you're playing games, turn off hardware acceleration in the settings for Firefox or Chrome or whatever if you are GPU bound. But if you're CPU bound, yeah, in that case you do want to have hardware acceleration on. Now you may be wondering, how do I know if I'm GPU bound or if I'm CPU bound? All you have to do to find that out is, again, go into the task manager, and ideally, surely you have a second monitor, right? I'm sure you do. Go into your task manager, open it up, and then play the game for like a minute or two. And definitely make sure you go to a 96 player fight and see if the CPU or the GPU are maxing out, like which one's maxing out. And that will tell you which one's your pain point as to like what's slowing down your game. And based off that, we can then tweak our settings a little bit in order to make sure that we have the best settings for you. But first off, I do also want to make sure that you have a high performance enabled on your power options in Windows. And likewise, for me personally, I enjoy having these appearance and performance options with my Windows. I actually think it feels better, so I'll do it for that reason. Also, apparently it adds an extra FPS or two, so. So now I'm sure that you've done all that and not ignored any of it. You've definitely done it all. Now we can go into our NVIDIA settings or AMD equivalent, and if you want to, just turn the vibrancy and the saturation and maybe even the contrast a little bit, tweak it a little bit to what you enjoy and what aesthetically feels good for you. For due diligence purposes, I will also say that you can get a game filter for Planetside, which does make it look better, but it will also make your computer run way slower. But it does look really nice, so if you got like a RTX 3080 and you're on 1080p or something, you may want to look into adding a game filter for Planetside, because it will make the game look nicer. Now, the host for Planetside guides was kind enough to let me use these pictures here, which essentially denote what the NVIDIA graphics settings should be in general for Planetside without having to tweak anything in game, and there might be things there that might help a little bit. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is, are you using a stock CPU cooler if you're CPU bottlenecked? If you are, you might benefit from a slight upgrade in CPU cooler for like a moderate amount of money. Don't go overboard on that, because you legitimately don't need a really high-end CPU cooler in order to get good performance out of your CPU. It's just something that you'd use if you're trying to get really high benchmarks, like 2% better or whatever, but it's not something that you need. So just get like a mediumly priced CPU cooler if you want to go that route. Likewise, assuming that you have a custom CPU cooler, you can turn PBO on in your motherboard settings, and that will essentially perform an automatic overclock for your processor in order to make it run a bit quicker, and it will sometimes tighten up the numbers for some of the other components as well, including the RAM. Likewise, you may want to check with your RAM how fast is it, and then also go into Task Manager and see does it match up with that, because normally a lot of people don't realize this, but when you get your high-end super fast RAM, unless you go and manually overclock it yourself, it's going to actually be set at the lowest possible it can run at. So usually that will be like 2600 gigahertz or something, when you may be able to run way harder. Another thing that you may want to consider doing if you've got an older computer is putting on some new thermal paste on your CPU. And likewise, you can, and I've done this myself, put some new thermal paste on my GPU as well. For me, this took my temperatures of my GTX 970 down from a bottlenecked 80 Celsius running at like 60% to running 100% at like 75 Celsius. And so for me, thermal paste helps a bunch. I got Cryonaut, but there is other thermal paste that you can get as well if you want it. But yeah, in general, if your GPU's a few years old, I really would look at reapplying the thermal paste to your GPU, and likewise you can do it for your CPU as well if you want it. And again, that may depend on what you're bottlenecked on. And I know that reapplying thermal paste sounds difficult, but really all you have to do is unscrew some screws. You want to get like a coffee filter and some isopropyl alcohol, and you can like clear that old thermal paste off really easy, and then just reapply the thermal paste. Super easy to do. Okay, so now with all of that context that we've got, we can now look at the settings for Planetside 2 and alter that around a bit. I want you guys to open up your user options Zinni and just have a look at it for 30 seconds or a minute or two, and just kind of try to understand what each of the settings mean when you look at this raw text file. You may notice that there's some settings that aren't included when you look at this user options Zinni, and they're lines that you're going to have to add in yourself. So for example, if you need to run smoothing because you get below 150 FPS in large fights, you may need to add in a line that says max smoothing FPS, so that you can get above the normal 60 FPS with smoothing on. Now before we get into the graphics, I also want you to turn up your field of view from the usual 74, which I never recommend for anyone really, and turn it up to 80 and then see how you feel. Personally, I have mine on 105, and I think that 105 field of view is the best kind of option, but it will feel weird for like a day or two, but you'll get super used to it. But really, like a less controversial FOV that more people would agree on would be like 90 or 84. Apparently above 85 you get a fisheye effect on a 16:9 ratio monitor. So yeah, you can go to like 84 FOV without having to worry about that fisheye effect. Now one of the easiest settings to turn down is certainly the shadows, because that's going to disproportionately affect the FPS of your game relative to everything else. And so if you're only looking to make minor adjustments, that might be all you need to make. And by the way, changing these settings in game means that you can't sometimes lower them as low as you can via this user options Zinni, and so altering them via this user options Zinni generally is recommended, especially if you want to play on potato mode, which is now what I'm going to introduce you to. There is a mode that you can have in order to make sure that everything is turned down to its most lowest setting possible. Now if you are CPU bound, you may benefit from having the textures on ultra regardless, because having lower textures will make the images that it's trying to render in game be compressed and then uncompressed from what I understand. So you want to have your textures on ultra, especially if you have the RAM on your graphics card in order to do it, which is called VRAM from what I understand. And to be honest, any GPU these days, especially above like a 900 series GPU, you'll be fine. So yeah, probably keep your textures on ultra. By the way, when you turn down your field of view, make sure you enable wide view mode, otherwise it won't enable. And also you may notice the render distance is at 150. you can only set this to 300 in game, but to be honest, in infantry fights, you're not going to notice the difference between 150 and 300 if you only play in infantry fights. The only time in infantry combat you're going to need more than 150 meters, which is really far by the way, is when you're trying to look for Valkyries or Galaxies which are incoming from the opposition or allies. And likewise, if you're like sniping from really long distances, yeah, maybe you want to have more than 150 meters and you want to have 300 meters instead. And by the way, for your vehicles, you don't really need anything above 1400 meters for land vehicles and 2000 meters for aircraft vehicles, because the server won't give you any information above those rendering distances from what I understand. And by the way, if you are like a super salty tryhard player, you may want to set your maximum FPS to 0, and this is essentially the same as turning VSync off. And on paper, in theory, it will turn down the delay, although I've not seen any evidence to support that. It is the theory. As for the other settings, personally, I would just turn them down to lowest and like play around with them a bit. If you want to have your particles higher, you can, in order to see tracer bullets. So for example, if you're in a Banshee, maybe you want to see the tracer rounds, because you want to be in air-to-air combat, and that's useful, I guess. Or like if you're playing sniper and you want to see when you're getting shot at. So particles can have some use cases. Now in the description, I am actually going to leave a link to the Planetside guide stuff on graphics settings for what specifically each graphics setting does, because they offer very detailed explanations on what each graphics setting specifically does and what its impact is. Oh, also one last thing, if you've got an SSD, make sure Planetside's installed on it. It probably won't help with FPS, but it certainly will help with loading times by a decent degree. Now I think this should be the most detailed and comprehensive video guide, and perhaps guide in general, on graphics that has ever existed for this game. If you do like this kind of content, I very much encourage you to like the video, subscribe because it does help the channel a bunch, and feel free to comment if I've left anything out so that I can add it into the next inevitable iteration of this guide. I look forward to reading the comments. I hope you have a wonderful day. I'm out. GG. Bye bye.